They weren't soldiers. They weren't armed. They weren't even given a trial. They were wives, and they were executed in front of thousands, in broad daylight, while the world looked away. What you're about to hear isn't a rumor. It isn't propaganda. It is documented. It is real. And it is one of the most disturbing chapters in modern history that almost no one talks about. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand why this happened, who allowed it, and what it revealed about a system of power so brutal. It erased women not just from public life, but from the right to exist. Afghanistan. 1996, the Taliban had just captured Kabul. The civil war was over, but a different kind of war had begun. A war not fought with guns and bombs, but with rules, decrees, lists. No school for girls, no work for women, no music, no laughter in public, no face visible to strangers. And if you broke these rules, you didn't go to jail. You went to the stadium. Kabul Sports Stadium, once a place of games, of cheering crowds, of young men playing football, became something else entirely under Taliban rule. It became a theater of punishment. And the audience was not optional. But here's what most history books skip over. The executions weren't just of criminals. They weren't just of men accused of robbery or murder. Some of those brought to that stadium were women. Wives of men the Taliban had already killed, imprisoned, or labeled as enemies. Women who had done nothing, except exist in the wrong household, and what happened to them. We need to talk about. Before we go further, if you're new to X history, this is exactly what we do here. We don't flinch from hard history. We don't sanitize it. We bring you the stories that textbooks buried, that news channels glossed over, and that the powerful hoped you'd forget. Hit subscribe, because this channel exists for people who want to actually understand the world, not just hear comfortable versions of it. Now, let's go back to understand what happened to these women. You need to understand something first. The Taliban didn't just want political control. They wanted moral control. Total, absolute, theological control over every human being inside Afghan borders. And in their worldview, built from a specific, extreme interpretation of Pashtun tribal code, mixed with a hardened version of religious law, a woman was not an individual. She was property, not in a metaphorical sense, literally, legally, socially. A woman belonged to her father, then to her husband, then to her husband's family. She had no separate legal identity, no separate rights, no separate existence, which meant, and this is the part that should make your blood run cold, that when a man was declared an enemy of the Taliban, his wife inherited that guilt. She didn't choose it. She didn't endorse it. She may not have even known what her husband had done or been accused of doing, but guilt in this system was not personal. It was familial, bloodline, and being the wife of an enemy made you an enemy too. Now imagine being that woman. You wake up one morning. Your husband has been taken. You don't know where. Days pass. Then someone knocks on your door, not to inform you, not to offer support, but to summon you to the stadium. And here's what no one prepares you for. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't screaming soldiers dragging people through the streets. It was organized, calm, almost administrative. That's what made it so terrifying. The Taliban had a system, committees, procedures, a religious police force called the Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahi Anil Munkar, the Ministry for the Propagation of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice. They had enforcers with radios and vehicles and schedules, and on execution days, they had programs. Crowds were assembled, announcements were made, the charges were read aloud, and then the sentence was carried out, publicly, deliberately, and with the full weight of a government behind it. Because that's what the Taliban was by this point. Not a militia, Not a rebel group hiding in mountains. A government, recognized by 3 countries, holding embassies, printing its own decrees on official letterhead. And that government had decided that certain women needed to die. But who were these women specifically? What were their names? What had their husbands allegedly done? And perhaps most chilling of all, who was in that crowd watching? Because some of those witnesses are alive today, and a few of them have talked. We left off with a question. Who were these women? What were their names? And who was watching from that crowd? Because this wasn't a secret. This wasn't hidden in some remote village, buried under sand and silence. This happened in Kabul, the capital city, in front of thousands of people, in a stadium that had international journalists occasionally passing through, and still, the world did almost nothing. That's the story of part 2. Not just what happened inside that stadium, but how the world knew and looked away anyway. Let's start with what we actually have on record. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, known as RAWA. These organizations spent years collecting testimonies from Afghan women who had escaped, from men who had been forced to attend these public punishments, and from journalists who had smuggled footage out of the country at enormous personal risk. What they documented was not isolated. It was not occasional. It was policy. One testimony, collected by RAWA in the late 1990s, describes a woman brought to Ghazi Stadium in Kabul. She was dressed in a full burqa, as required. She was led to the center of the field. The charges against her were announced over a loudspeaker. Her husband had been labeled an enemy of the Islamic. A merit. She was not given a chance to speak. The sentence was carried out in under 4 minutes. 4 minutes. And then the next case was announced. But here's the detail that historians rarely emphasize. The crowd wasn't just allowed to watch, they were required to. Taliban enforcers moved through Kabul's neighborhoods before execution days, knocking on doors, ordering men to attend. Non-attendance was itself a punishable offense. You could be beaten for staying home. So picture this. Thousands of Afghan men sitting in that stadium, not because they wanted to be there, but because refusing meant risking punishment themselves. Many of them had wives, daughters, sisters, and they sat in silence, watching, because what else could they do? This psychological dimension is something Western media almost never captures. The Taliban didn't just use the stadium to punish the accused. They used it to break the witnesses, to make an entire male population complicit in what was happening to their own women. It was control through trauma. Collective, enforced, inescapable trauma. Now, the footage. In 1999, a video emerged that shook the few people who actually saw it. It was filmed secretly, smuggled out of Afghanistan, and eventually shared with international journalists and human rights organizations. It showed a public execution at Ghazi Stadium. The person being executed was a woman. She was in a blue burqa. She was led to the center of the pitch. She knelt, and within seconds, it was over. The crowd made almost no sound. That silence is what people who watched the footage remembered most. Not screaming, not chaos, just silence. Like the entire stadium had stopped breathing. RAWA published this footage with an urgent call to the international community. They begged for intervention. They named it for exactly what it was, a war crime. A systematic, government-sanctioned campaign of gender-based murder. The United Nations released statements. Human rights organizations published reports. And the world's governments largely continued their existing policies, which, for most powerful nations at the time, meant either quiet diplomacy or strategic indifference. Because Afghanistan's geopolitical position made full confrontation complicated. That was the word diplomats used. Tell that to the woman in the blue burqa. But there's one name you need to know. One case that broke through the silence louder than almost any other, and it involves a woman whose story became a symbol not just in Afghanistan, but eventually globally. Her name was Zarmeena, November 17th, 2001. Just weeks after the September 11th attacks, just weeks before the UC-led coalition would begin dismantling Taliban control in Afghanistan. The Taliban knew their time in power was potentially ending. And yet, on that day, they brought a woman named Zarmeena to Ghazi Stadium. She was a mother of 7 children. The charge? She had allegedly killed her husband, a man who, by multiple accounts from her own family and neighbors, had subjected her to years of severe domestic abuse. In almost any other legal system in the world, this context would have been examined. A trial would have been held. Evidence would have been weighed. The Taliban held no trial. They brought her to the stadium. They made her kneel in her burqa. And they executed her. But someone in that crowd had a camera hidden beneath their clothing. That footage made it out. RAWA released it. And this time, because it was November 2001, because the world's eyes were already on Afghanistan, people actually watched. CNN covered it. BBC covered it. For a brief, burning moment, Zarmeena's death was not invisible. But here's what haunts historians who study this period. Zarmeena was not the first. She was not even close to the last during Taliban rule. She became known only because of timing, because a camera was there, because the political moment made the world briefly willing to look. How many women came before her, whose names we will never know? Let's return to the specific category we started with, the wives of men labeled as Taliban enemies. This was a documented recurring practice. When a commander, a politician, a former Northern Alliance fighter, or even a local civilian was killed or imprisoned by the Taliban, his family didn't simply mourn in peace. They became targets. Taliban enforcers would arrive. Property would be seized. And in certain documented cases, particularly where the husband had been a high-profile enemy, the wife would be brought in for questioning. That was, in reality, a process leading toward public punishment. The logic within the Taliban's framework was theological, but it was also deeply practical. Publicly executing the wife of an enemy sent a message to every other potential enemy. Your resistance will cost your family everything. It was deterrence through the destruction of the people you loved most. And it worked. Testimonies from Afghan men who survived this era describe the paralyzing fear, not just for themselves, but for their wives and daughters. That fear kept entire communities silent. But none of this, not the footage, not the testimonies, not RAWA's desperate calls, none of it produced the intervention these women deserved while the Taliban was still in power. And the reason why is something that implicates governments, intelligence agencies, and geopolitical decisions made thousands of miles away from Kabul. That story, the story of who enabled the Taliban's rise, who funded the conditions that made this possible, and who knew and stayed quiet, that is what Part 3 is going to cover. Because the executions didn't happen in a vacuum. They happened in a world that, in many ways, built the environment that made them possible. And some of the countries responsible, you'd recognize their names immediately. We just watched a government execute women in a stadium. We just heard how the world saw the footage and mostly looked away. But now comes the question that should make every single one of us deeply uncomfortable. How did the Taliban get there in the first place? Because groups like this don't rise from nothing. They don't appear out of thin air with weapons, funding, structure, and international recognition. Someone built this. Someone armed it. Someone, at some point, decided that the Taliban was useful. And the trail, when you follow it honestly, without flinching, leads to some of the most powerful nations on Earth. Let's go back, way back, to 1979. The Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. Cold War tension is at its peak. The United States, under President Jimmy Carter and then Ronald Reagan, makes a strategic decision. They will fund, arm, and train Afghan resistance fighters to bleed the Soviets dry. The program was called Operation Cyclone. It became one of the longest and most expensive covert operations in CIA history, pumping billions of dollars into Afghan Mujahideen fighters through Pakistan's intelligence agency. Now, here's where it gets complicated. The CIA wasn't very selective about who received that money and those weapons. The priority was fighting Soviets, not vetting ideology. Saudi Arabia matched American funding dollar for dollar, bringing its own religious and ideological influence into the mix. Pakistani military leadership had its own agenda for what kind of Afghanistan it wanted on its border. The result? A generation of fighters trained in warfare, soaked in an extreme interpretation of religious law, armed with American weapons, and answering to Pakistani strategic interests. The Soviets eventually left in 1989. The Mujahideen turned on each other. Afghanistan collapsed into civil war. And from that chaos, from that specific, internationally manufactured chaos, the Taliban emerged. Only 3 countries in the entire world officially recognized the Taliban government: Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. 3 countries. And at least 2 of them had deep, ongoing relationships with Western powers who knew exactly what the Taliban was doing inside Afghanistan. Pakistan's EC didn't just tolerate the Taliban. According to declassified documents, testimonies from former Pakistani officials, and reporting by journalists like Ahmed Rashid, whose landmark book, Taliban Remains the Definitive Account, the EC actively supported, guided, and in certain periods, directly facilitated Taliban operations. Their reasoning was strategic. Pakistan wanted a friendly, controllable government in Afghanistan, a buffer against Indian influence, a reliable neighbor. What they got instead was a regime that publicly executed women in stadiums. But even then, even with full knowledge of what was happening inside Afghanistan, the relationship between Pakistan's military establishment and Taliban leadership continued quietly, carefully, but it continued. And Western intelligence agencies knew this. American officials knew this. It was documented, reported, debated behind closed doors. The women in that stadium died while those conversations were happening in air-conditioned offices thousands of miles away. But Pakistan wasn't the only calculation being made. In the mid-1990s, an American oil company called Unocal was negotiating with the Taliban for rights to build a pipeline through Afghanistan. American businessmen sitting across tables from the same men who were running those executions. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented, reported history. Unocal representatives met with Taliban officials multiple times between 1995 and 1998. The proposed pipeline would carry natural gas from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan to Pakistan, bypassing Iran, bypassing Russia, serving American energy interests perfectly. Taliban delegations were even brought to the United States, to Texas. They were hosted, shown around, treated as potential business partners. During this same period, RAWA was publishing reports about public executions. Amnesty International was documenting systematic gender-based violence. The evidence was not hidden, but pipelines apparently required a certain tolerance for horror. The negotiations eventually collapsed, not primarily because of human rights concerns, but because of business disagreements and growing instability. Unocal withdrew in 1998 after U.S. missile strikes on Afghanistan, following the embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania. Business, not conscience, ended those meetings. And yet, through all of this, there were Afghan women who refused to disappear. Who documented everything, who smuggled footage, who ran underground schools for girls in private homes, who built networks of resistance so quiet and so brave that most of the world will never fully understand what it cost them. The Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan was founded in 1977. By the time the Taliban took power, RAWA members were operating entirely underground, their identities hidden, their locations secret, their work punishable by death. They ran covert schools. They documented executions. They collected testimonies. They produced a magazine called Payam-e-Zan, Voice of Women, printed secretly and distributed at enormous risk. And they used early internet infrastructure to bring their documentation to international audiences, uploading footage, publishing reports, emailing journalists at a time when most of the world had barely heard of the Taliban. These women are among the bravest human beings of the 20th century, and almost none of them are household names, while politicians who failed them fill history books. The women who refused to let this history disappear remain largely unknown outside specialist circles. That is its own kind of injustice. Taliban fell in late 2001. American and coalition forces moved in. The world exhaled. But here's what the exhale missed entirely. In August 2021, the Taliban retook Afghanistan. 20 years of international presence, billions of dollars spent, thousands of lives lost, Afghan and foreign alike. And within days of American withdrawal, the Taliban walked back into Kabul. Almost immediately, the rollback began. Girls' schools closed again. Women were removed from government positions. Female journalists disappeared from television screens. Women were ordered back into full coverings, back into their homes, back into the same invisible existence that had defined Taliban rule in the 1990s. Reports of public punishments began circulating again, not yet at the scale of the stadium executions, but documented, verified, and deeply alarming to human rights organizations who had seen this pattern before. The international community issued statements, strongly worded statements. And the Taliban continued. Here is what I want you to carry with you after this video ends. Zarmeena had 7 children. 7 children who watched their mother taken away, who may have been in that city on November 17, 2001, when the footage was recorded, who grew up in an Afghanistan that then briefly changed, and then changed back again. We don't know where those children are today. We don't know if they are safe. We don't know if the daughters among them are currently living under the same system that killed their mother. That uncertainty is not an abstraction. It is a real, living, ongoing consequence of decisions made by governments, intelligence agencies, and international institutions that had, and continue to have, the power to act differently. History is not just the past. It is the architecture of the present. Every atrocity that was allowed to continue without accountability becomes the foundation for the next one. The women executed in that stadium were not statistics. They were not symbols. They were human beings with names, with children, with ordinary lives that contained ordinary joys. A good meal, a warm morning, the sound of their children laughing before those lives were taken from them by a system that decided they didn't deserve to exist. Remembering them is not enough, but it is where accountability begins. If this video made you feel something, if it made you think, then share it. Not for the algorithm, for the women whose stories deserve to be heard by more than the people who already know to look for them. History exists because history, told honestly, is the most powerful thing in the world. Subscribe. Stay with us. Because next time we go even deeper.